I've been asked to say some opening words, so I'm going to read a statement from the activists here. They don't feel able to read it themselves because they're afraid of repercussions from the university with consequences for their academic careers. So I think that just speaks volumes. That speaks for itself, doesn't it, that people don't want to have their names or their faces associated with the statement, but I'm happy to read it. Okay. Dear all, today we're gathered for what would have been a lecture on how Israel's Zionist project is rooted in anti-Semitism and how Jewish Zionists collaborated with Nazis and betrayed their own people. Our speaker, Tony Greenstein, is a 70-year-old anti-Zionist, anti-fascist historian and is himself Jewish. But TU Delft opted to censor our event, vaguely claiming that Tony's views violate the university's code of conduct. No substantiation for what part is violated has been given to date. This makes us wonder who is being threatened by his opinions. We think it is nobody, apart from the military-industrial complex which is deeply enmeshed in this university. It feels surreal that in the same country where the International Court of Justice is headquartered, its institutions and politicians continue to support Israel's criminal campaign in Gaza, that our university continues to collaborate with genociders and continues to dodge accountability for the same. TU Delft is supporting the genocide under the banner of academic freedom. The freedom to investigate new ways to murder children, that is. Drones, AI, advanced fighter jets, every weapon imaginable is being developed by this university and its close partners. Yet that same so-called academic freedom crumbles to dust when we want to critically examine its actions, when Jewish speakers themselves want to question the narrative that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. The way this right to academic freedom is selectively applied reminds us that our freedom to debate and discover knowledge is subject to its value for TU Delft's wallet. Just 2 weeks ago, at Aula Conference Centrum, a prime example of our university's enthusiastic collaboration with war profiteers took place. The Systems Workforce Summit, which began on the 8th of October in the Aula, featured speakers from Thales and Lockheed Martin, two corporations that profit from the genocide in Palestine and Lebanon and from wars around the world. Their profits soar every time a child is bombed to shreds. Most notably, TU Delft invited Admiral James O. Ellis of Lockheed Martin as a speaker. He spent his entire career at the helm of US invasions, and for the last 20 years he has sat on the board of Lockheed Martin, ensuring his own share of war profits. No justification was required for how Mr. Ellis's opinions align with the Code of Conduct. The alternative is spine-chilling, that perhaps the murder of Palestinian children and Mr. Ellis profiting off it does align with TU Delft's values. And yet, to this day, TU Delft has failed to disclose what logic was used to decide that Tony Greenstein is not welcome, because his views allegedly do not align with their version of inclusivity. No opportunity was given to contest this decision, which was clearly arbitrary, based on power rather than logic. They cannot uphold their own standards, and therefore operate under a regime of double standards. We applaud our speaker's determinations to stand up for justice. At 70 years old, he is still a threat to Zionism, not with violence, but with wisdom and courage. Despite being censored, he remains undeterred. He is a brave man, a fighter for civil rights, and we're privileged to have him here today. He will enlighten us on how Israel's Zionist project is rooted in anti-Semitism and how Jewish Zionists collaborated with Nazis and betrayed their own people. Dear all, please welcome Tony Greenstein.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to speak to you. As you can see, it's not me as a person who threatens the safety of anyone, but what I have to say is certainly a threat to neoliberal Europe today. And what we do see with the refusal to book a room shares so much in common with the enemies of the Jews historically, because it dehumanizes the Palestinians as a means of conquering and eliminating them from the lands in which they are indigenous. And let me quote, it's a Rabbi Eliyahu Mali of Shariat Moshe Yeshiva in Jaffa. It formerly was Arab Jaffa. He was justifying the murder of Palestinian children, and he said, today's terrorists are the children of the previous military operation that left them alive. The women are the ones who are producing the terrorists. It's not only the 14 or 16-year-old boy, the 20 or 30-year-old man who takes up a weapon, but also the future generation. There is really no difference. In other words, this is a justification even for the murder of babies. And Benjamin Netanyahu, when the war or the conflict or the attack on Gaza started, he invoked the memory of Amalek. This was a tribe that attacked the mythical children of Israel on their sojourn from Egypt to the land, to the promised land. And God commanded them to kill every man, woman, child, infant, and also their cows, their oxen, and their sheep. The message was very clear. It was a message of extermination. And that is what Israel has been embarked on. Let me remind you that when the Nazis came to power in 1933, their program was not the extermination of the Jews, it was the ethnic cleansing of Germany of the Jews, the removal of Jews from Europe. It was only when that project failed in 1941 that the Holocaust began, although we could argue that the Holocaust really began with the murder of the disabled, the so-called euthanasia campaign in 1939. But nonetheless, the extermination of the Jews of Europe began when the ethnic cleansing project failed. Well, Zionism began, the State of Israel began in 1948 with the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. But although there were massacres, there was no genocide as such. Today we see that it has turned to a genocidal project. The Israeli settler colonial state is now embarked on genocide as well as ethnic cleansing. And let me just say, in Netherlands, I don't know how many of you know the history of the Holocaust in the Netherlands, but 75% of the Jews who live here were exterminated. They were taken from Westerbork to Auschwitz, compared to 25% in France and 50% in Belgium. The way the Nazis operated was through Judenrat, Jewish councils, which implemented the rounding up of the Jews. In France and in Belgium, the Judenrat were not permitted by the resistance, mainly led not by the right wing who cry about anti-Semitism today, but by the communists and the left. In Belgium, they assassinated Robert Holsinger, who was the leader of the Judenrat. They literally terrorized the Judenrat into disappearing. Unfortunately, the resistance in the Netherlands was not able to terrorize the Judenrat, which was led by David Cohen and Abraham Asher, who were supporters of Zionism. And everywhere in Europe where you had a Judenrat, you would have Zionists, the people who now run Israel, because Zionism was the political project to establish the state of Israel. And the Netherlands, in one sense, can be proud. It was the only place in Europe where there was a general strike against the deportations. It was based in Amsterdam, and it was repressed, and something like 300 workers were deported to Mauthausen concentration camp, where they were murdered. So the working class in the Netherlands stood up to the Nazis. And in this university, when the Nazis removed the Jewish professors, the students held a strike, and there was virtually no one attending. This was November the 23rd, 1940. Virtually no students attended the lecture of his replacement. But the rector at the time did his best to break the student strike. And I have to say, you are not very fortunate in your choice of rectors, because of course it was the rector who decided that I should be banned too. So he is a worthy successor to the 1940 rector, whose name I do not know. But that is the institution of those who govern these universities. They are not concerned with academic freedom, freedom of speech, or anything else. And I want to come on to Zionism itself, which I said was the movement to establish a Jewish state. Most people today associate Jews with Zionism, but that's incorrect. Christian Zionism preceded Jewish Zionism by 4 centuries. It was a product of the Renaissance and the Reformation, the idea that Jews should return to Palestine, although they had never been there. And the people who adopted it in the 19th century, because the biggest, the largest, the most powerful empire was the British Empire, were Christian evangelists like Lord Palmerston and Lord Shaftesbury. Palmerston was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And in 1840, he tried to persuade, along with Shaftesbury, the Board of Deputies of British Jews to support the return of Jews. And they refused. They refused. The reason why was simple. They were fighting for Jewish emancipation, which came about in 1858, the right of Jews to vote. The last thing they wanted to do was to accept that Jews were really not British and belonged in some other country. And that was the case right up to the Second World War. You will not learn it maybe in your history books, because history is written by people who are very careful as to what they say. But in Germany in 1933, the Zionists were 2% of the population, of the Jewish population, some 500,000 of Germany. Everywhere in Europe, the Zionists were in a minority. In Poland, the reservoir of European Jewry, 3 million out of their 3 million, 90% died in the Holocaust. In the last 3 elections in 1938, the local municipal elections, there were Jewish council seat elections throughout Poland because the Jews voted separately for their own council members. In Warsaw, out of 20 Jewish council seats, 17 were won by the anti-Zionist Bund, the General Jewish Workers' Union, a socialist union. Just 1 was won by the Zionists. Overall in Poland, over 61% of the Jewish vote went to the Bund. About 20% went to the Agudat Yisrael, which is an Orthodox religious group. The Zionists were in a tiny minority. And the reason why is simple. Because what Zionism says to Jewish people is, you don't belong where you live, you belong in Palestine. And if someone says to me, you don't belong in England, they're either an anti-Semite or a Zionist, or in the case of Geert Wilders, they're both. Because no one loves Zionism today more than the anti-Semitic right wing. Geert Wilders, Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, the AfD, which is riddled with Holocaust deniers in Germany, and so on. Anti-Semites have historically always loved Zionism. And that's not a message you'll get from the mass media. You'll get it by reading the book that I wrote, though, if that's any consolation. Because these are the truths that they hide from you. For example, the alliance between British imperialism and Zionism was consummated in November, I think it was November the 2nd, 1917. It was approved by the Lloyd George War Cabinet. The only member of that cabinet to vote against it was its only Jewish member, Sir Edwin Montagu. British Jews did not want Zionism. They wanted freedom. Freedom from anti-Semitism and freedom to live just like anybody else. What Zionism has done has pushed the Jews, the majority of Jews, to the right. However, I have to say, the protests in America and elsewhere have been led by groups like Jewish Voice for Palestine. Increasingly, Jews in the diaspora are understanding that Zionism is a poisoned chalice. It offers them absolutely nothing except war and more war, because Zionism really is the cat's paw of imperialism when it comes down to it. And I was going to just touch, if you like, on the record of Zionism, which is not a pretty one. You can read the trial of Rudolf Kastner in Israel. He was the leader of Hungarian Zionism. He reached an agreement with Adolf Eichmann, let out 1,600 elite Jews, mainly Zionists, but also bourgeois capitalists and so on. And I will say nothing about the revelations about Auschwitz, because an anti-Zionist Jew, Rudolf Verber, and his friends had escaped from Auschwitz on April the 10th, and they produced what was known as the Auschwitz Protocols. You can Google it for yourself, Rudolf Kastner, and you will read about the whole trial. But the record of the Zionists during the World War was one of unmitigated collaboration. They welcomed, the only section of Jewish people to welcome Hitler to power was the Zionists. Burl Katznelson, the deputy of David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, said this was a golden opportunity for Zionism. In times of peace, Zionism does not have a chance of winning over the Jewish people. It's only in times of war and distress that Zionism can appeal to the Jewish people. And that was the case. And in 1938, November 1938, you may, I'm sure, have learned from your history books, Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, when every synagogue virtually in Germany, every Jewish business, and 100 or more Jewish people were killed. It was a pogrom organised by the SA, by the Nazi party. 30,000 were interned in concentration camps. Britain offered to take 10,000 Jewish children in. It was a gesture that had not been made before, because usually the attitude of the British, like today to refugees, is to turn your back on them. And the Zionists were furious. David Ben-Gurion wrote in a memo to the Zionist executive, and it's in his official biography, so no one can doubt the accuracy of this. If I knew that it would be possible to save all the Jews in Germany by bringing them over to England, and only half of them by transporting them to Eretz Israel, that's the land of Israel, then I would opt for the second alternative. For we must weigh not only the life of these children, but also the history of the people of Israel. Zionism was about recreating, in its own image, the Jewish race. It's a racial building project. It's not about liberation or self-determination of Jewish people. And I just really want to end, because you may have questions and I'm more than happy to take them. The Israeli state claims to inherit the memory of the Jews who died in the Holocaust. What it does in reality is it inherits the memory of those who killed the Jews in the Holocaust. And that is the unvarnished truth. But that is a truth that your rector and the administration here did not want you to hear. So thank you very much. Parish church killing parishioners inside the church. I think one thing I think we can be certain of is Hamas doesn't have a base in a Christian church, but nonetheless, Israel attacked all of them. And that gives the lie to all the Israeli excuses that we only bomb Hamas bases. They're using them as human shields. Well, I think we know wherever the Hamas base is, it's underground. They're not in hospitals, and they're certainly not in churches, and they're not in mosques either. Anyone else wants to ask a question?
Again, thank you for coming and reading and letting all your information. I have a question because you compare the Zion. Well, you said about the Zionists that is more Zionist, right wing, concept. So, do you see in Europe like some changing in support in Israel, even though they might not change their their imperialist ways? Because I think that's not really seems to be changing soon. So you think even though that's the case, it might be some change in how the support is given to Israel, or basically not.
Well, in Europe, of course, the ruling classes in every country virtually support Israel and its project, not least, of course, the United States, Britain and Germany do. And they do that because they want to attain regional hegemony in the Middle East. That's the reason for the opposition to Iran. It has nothing to do with the nature of the Iranian regime, but because Israel wants to be the dominant player in the Middle East. They want to secure the oil. The Middle East is a strategic waterway. I think they're failing, but that's another matter. But I think people now understand in Europe to an extent they never did before that Israel is not the only democracy in the Middle East. On the contrary, it's the main threat to democracy in the Middle East. Israel has alliances with every reactionary authoritarian Arab regime like Saudi Arabia, the UAR and so on, Egypt, and you can go right through it. Israel is the guarantor of the, if you like, keeping the Arab peoples in their chains. And it will only be when the Arab peoples overthrow their own regimes that Zionism itself will be overthrown. But I think there's a change in perception. When I grew up, there was this idea that Israel was a liberal, social democratic country with collectivized kibbutzim, which were semi-socialist and so on. That idea has gone. They have Netanyahu. They have people further to the right who openly talk about extermination. I mean, they march every year on Jerusalem Day in May. Thousands of settlers are shepherded and swarm through Arab East Jerusalem, chanting, "Death to the Arabs." I mean, in Germany and in Poland, the slogan used to be, "Death to the Jews." So you can see the similarities between Zionism and the Nazi and the anti-Semitic movement. You don't have to go very far. I mean, I said 5 years ago in the Palestine Expo when I spoke that Israel was Hitler's bastard offspring. And the Jewish Chronicle had this big page. Notorious anti-Zionist calls Israel Hitler's bastard offspring. An offspring is a child. But it's proved true. It's exactly true. What they say in Israel today, the Zionists, about the Palestinians, and they're all saying, kill them off, get rid of them, etc. What they said about the Jews, the only difference, I would say, is that in Germany, Hitler never attained a majority. The highest vote he got in July 1932 was 34%. And in the November elections, the communists and the socialists got a higher vote than the Nazi Party, which is why Hitler was put into power by the conservatives, incidentally, because they feared he was losing. Germany was not rife with anti-Semitism. a myth if you think that. Between 1930 and 1933, the Nazi Party played down its anti-Semitism because it was not popular. What they did was campaign on an anti-Marxist, anti-Bolshevik, anti-communist platform. And all historians of any note recognise that fact. In Herschel, who's the main historian, Thomas Merkel, but many others as well. But in Israel today, the level of racism against Palestinians is literally off the scale. The number of Israelis who are anti-Zionist is less than 1%. So that is the scale of the problem. Anyone else?
I was wondering, I was curious about thank you again for coming. I was wondering, for me, looking at the situation with, of course, the engineering mindset, it does feel like there's a recurring theme going around the world, and this is one example of it, where there's like divide that's growing between cultures, between peoples, between countries in some circumstances, and it seems to me a bit ridiculous that we managed to fuse atoms in the last century, but somehow we're struggling to fuse people and cultures together. And like for atoms, it makes sense, there's one force that repels them. So in your from your personal opinion and expertise, what would you say are the forces dividing people from joining together? If there's one specific thing, or there's maybe two or three critical things that really do keep us away, or helps those who wish to keep us apart to really abuse those two or three parameters, let's say.
Thank you. I should add that the security has asked that I put out my cigarette, so I was happy to oblige on that score at least. I'm a threat, yes. I'm a smoker, yes, probably. What keeps people apart? Well, I think we live in a dystopia, an asocial system, which is a capitalist system. I'm a Marxist, I'm a socialist. We see today the world where the United States spends $1 trillion a year on weaponry. It has a vast military-industrial complex, yet it cannot afford basic health care for its own people. And that is, if you like, an example of the skewed priorities of the system we live in. We are literally destroying our planet because the global drive by the multinationals for profit means that people are kept in subjection. That is really what the Palestinians have been experiencing. If you like, the global domination led by the United States of the oil resources of the Middle East, and everything and anything is dispensable for that. So until we tackle the social system, the economic system we live in, we will never bring people together, because capitalism creates refugees. It drives them to the West in search of work and refuge. They're then thrown out or discriminated against. Racism is a product of imperialism and colonialism. So until we change the system we live in, we will never ever bring people together. Because at the moment you have a very few billionaires and trillionaires even now, I believe, who own the vast majority of the world's wealth. And yet you have millions and billions of people who have literally the clothes on their back. That is the problem that we face.
And in between a technical note, it's actually hard to fuse atoms. Fission. They don't well.
Is there anyone else who would like to ask?